How are you guys? Welcome back to Wargaming China. I see you've got 61 subscribers now. That's great. Keep up subscribing please. And pressing like if you like what I do. So right now what you're looking at is a Hai Ning class patrol boat of Chang's Navy. And I made it myself. And I want to talk about the Hai Ning, how it was built, how it was developed, talk a little bit about the war that China's Navy faced, and I'll probably ramble on about a few other things too. So you might want to get yourself a drink, or just turn off now because you're going to be really bored. Okay, so if we look at the Chinese Navy, we have to look at a force in the period up to 1945. We have to look at a force that is quite disparaged historically and was famous as the most corrupt branch of all the services. But at the same time, we have to remember too that like everything else in China, the Chinese Navy was full of contradictions too. Now, today, when I'm talking, I'm going to be drawing a lot on the work of Chris Roberts' China's Sunken Warships blogspot, whatever it is, and also Roger Branfield Cook's River Gunboats, because there's actually not a lot of information out there. Sorry, it's Robert Whiston. There's not actually a lot of information out there, and thanks to Robert Whiston and Roger Branfield Cook and a few scant sources on the internet, we can, I looked at China's surface actions of its fleet, and I came to a lot of different conclusions. The two authors that I'm talking about, they approached the subject of China's Navy's war from two different angles, which I really appreciated because it helped me understand from both sides. So, as I said, this is my understanding of it. Okay, China, by 1937, when hostilities were open, the Chinese Navy had even greater odds stacked against it than the Chinese Army or even the Air Force. As I said, the Chinese Navy was known for corruption, but its sailors were never found wanting. And you will find that when you look at the history of the Chinese ships that went down in this area, and there are lots, it either seems to be sunk, scuttled, or sunk by air attack. They all seem to go that way. Very few are going to be involved in surface engagements with the Japanese opposition. And the reason for this is the Japanese have overwhelming air superiority, and the Chinese Navy cannot really ever be powerful enough or have enough reserves that it will ever have the strength to challenge the Japanese Navy. Now, I'm going to tell you an example of the corruption of the Chinese fleet, in one of the first surface engagements that the Chinese faced in 1904, when their brand new Chinese cruisers opened fire on the Japanese ships. The shells, the high explosive shells, failed to explode when they hit the Japanese warships, and the reason for this is that the Japanese officers had sold the explosives to mining companies. So that's a great example of how corrupt the Chinese Navy were. However, if you look at fiction and all literature, they'll talk about piracy, larceny, and all other kinds of skullduggery behavior involving the Chinese Navy and how it took its graft. However, I have never been able to find any evidence of piracy, any court cases or anything like that. But look, China's rivers are massive. Her navy was poorly funded. And even now, China has a policy of having our armed forces in partially paying for themselves. But another contradiction about the Chinese Navy is its arsenal, its Taku arsenal, was probably the best in China. And you can always tell some of the firearms that came out of the Taku arsenal, like the Taku arsenal version of the MP18, but instead of the magazine being on the left, it's underneath. It's loaded from underneath. So you know, they were quite technically innovative at the Taku arsenal. They produced Madsons. They produced ammo for 40mm Bofors, 40mm pom-pom. They produced 3-inch ammunition for Vickers guns. They produced 88mm ammunition for a few of the Krupp howitzers that were mounted on some of the Chinese boats. So yes, that's an example of an 88 in Chinese service. And one day, when I build that particular type of gun, I'll do an expo on the various 88s of China. Now, having said all that, if we look at certain instances like the defense of the Xinjiang naval base, we can see that the Chinese Navy is in a position where it cannot fight offensively. But what it can do is it can retreat along the great rivers of China, blocking tributaries and access points against the progress of the Japanese. Now this is a strategy that, although it's cost them heavily in ships, it does slow the Japanese down significantly. And as I said in a previous video I did, the Chinese sailors themselves are very, very good at salvaging their ships, scuttling them, and even refloating them later. You know, the Japanese never really had any problems as far as getting quite a few scuttled former Chinese boats back into their service, because the Chinese crews would cover all the machinery with grease, and do a pretty good job of covering all the vital parts of the ship that were going to be underwater. So yeah, as a blocking tactics was the strategy that was adapted by the Chinese Navy. And if we look at the odds that most of those small ships were facing, and let's remember the Chinese never had anything bigger than a light cruiser, and it stuck defensively to the great rivers of China, and the Japanese were sending heavy cruisers up the rivers, up some parts of the rivers of China. So we can't underestimate the Chinese Navy, and we do have to say thanks to the Chinese sailor for slowing down the Japanese advance. Now then, I'm going to talk about what I've built now. This, as you know, as I said before, is a Hai Ning class patrol boat of the Yangtze River Flotilla. Okay, now I'm basically going to quote straight from the book here, because well, this is his original info of Branfill. So the Hai Ning class were built between 1932 and 1934 with technical assistance from Germany via the firm Hapro. They were also capable of being used as mine layers. The first prototype of these ships launched was the Shen Shung. She was launched in 1928. After the prototype Shen Shung was made, they decided to continue with it, and as I said, they made 10 more with the assistance of Germany, with German assistance. There was plans to make an 11th, and the 11th, the hull was laid down. They were all built in Shanghai. The hull was laid down. It was the first welded hull vessel to go into Chinese military service, and unfortunately it was captured by the Japanese in dry dock and later put into Japanese service, I think. So they weighed 300 tons. They were armed with either an 88mm Krupp, 3-inch Vickers, or 3-inch Hotchkiss. Now, when I talk about the 88 Krupp, remember this is a howitzer, it's a naval gun, it is not the Flak 16, Flak 18, Flak 36 of later war years. This is, it's a naval weapon. Now, as for the mountings I used, these ships weighed 300 tons. They had a crew of 44. They were 43 meters long, 6 meters wide, and as I said, I have two 3-inch guns and two pom-poms. Two 3-inch guns and two pom-poms. The pom-poms were 40mm as standard as in the later mod type. So in the Hai Ning class, the boats built later on were all fitted with 40mm pom-poms. The earlier ones were fitted with 37mm pom-poms. The reason the latter ones were fitted with 40mm pom-poms is China was producing, the Taku arsenal was producing its own 40mm ammunition, but not the 37mm ammunition. And also, although it did produce some of the 88mm ammunition, at some point in the war, when the factory was retreating, the machine tools were lost. So those guns were replaced by 3-inch Hotchkiss or 3-inch Vickers. So when it comes to making the model, it's a balsa wood base. Each porthole is a washer. The front anchor point, I'm not a naval man, is insert from a screw to cover a screw in a light socket, in a switch. The same for the back. That's a rubber O-ring, the life buoy. Now, they are the air intakes for the toughest bit to build in this vessel, and the life rafts. Now, I'm going to tell you now that about building ships. If you're building a ship for the war game table, don't build it at a scale of 1/72. You know, don't build it at 30mm per meter, because you're just going to end up with too big a ship. I try to build the hull at 1/100, and then do the superstructure and the bridge and that in about 176. Also, what I do is I used a Barocca tin for the ship's steam stack, smokestack, and red box French sailors, and the French sailor which I converted into Chinese sailors. And this finally is the right uniform. It's a navy blue, dark navy blue, with the hat with a blue base and a black stripe around it, you know, black band around the bottom of it. I made this ship so that I could pull the guns off, take the flag out, and recrew it with perhaps the Japanese Navy or even the Royal Navy. Although I'd have to do research on the uniform and see if it was right for the Royal Navy. So this ship, I wanted to be adaptable. It took me a couple of weeks. I had time off over Christmas, so I did a lot of it. I used card, pins, paper clips, bits from my spares box. The air intakes were tough. Also, I built it so that I could put it in a cupboard, in my drawer, sorry, and it had to fit in there. The drawer's only 100mm high, so I built it so that would come out, the mast. Because as I said, in wargaming, if you're going to build something, even as a modeler, you want to build something that you're capable of looking after, that you've got space for, you know? Space is at a premium. So another tip that I use this time that I haven't used before is I cut up individual pieces of cardboard for the hull, and then I tucked in pins between the joints to look, you know, for rivets, and pins I just push straight into the timber with a block here to make sure each one was the right size. Just push it down to the height of the block. The forward light is a nail. The gun mounts are gas barbecue bottle bungs. These guns are just simple toy guns I've had in my stash box for years. The lifeboats were hard. I didn't get them right. But all in all, I was pretty happy with it. So I've talked about the Hai Ning. I've talked about how Japanese air superiority really decimated China's fleets, and as a defensive action, the only thing the Chinese could do was to retreat, try to keep their fleet intact, and block lanes and channels on the river systems of China. And even though this isn't an offensive technique, it certainly did contribute to the Japanese having to work harder and take a little bit longer than they would have done had the Chinese Navy not followed this strategy. Now, as I said before, a couple of weeks ago I did a video on the Thornycroft coastal motorboat and its attack on the Exuma in August of 1937, and you know, this would represent one of the very few offensive operations against the Japanese. So there you go. I hope you weren't too bored. I hope I didn't waffle on too much. If you like that, hit like. If you really like that, then maybe you should subscribe. Okay, thank you. See you later.